She raised the beam up, and up, taking in the full height of the impossible thing that stood there, hissing, its jaws dripping with drool. It was no rat. 12. Marilyn held Therese tightly to her in the cab of the truck and slumped down as far as she could in the seats below the windshield. The woman with the gun walked noisily between the rows of vehicles, shouting out the name of the man who they had seen so gruesomely taken by the creature. She wouldn't find him in one piece, and if she kept shouting like that, she was going to suffer the same fate. Marilyn bit her lip, torn between the desire to warn the woman and protection for herself and her daughter from the murderous newcomers. Therese whimpered. "Shh, little flower," Marilyn said, pushing the little girl further down into the footwell. She chanced to look through the windscreen. She had lost sight of the woman and lifted herself a little higher to scan the garage. Wow! She screamed as something slammed against the glass. It was the woman, blood pumping from her mouth, eyes glassy. A gaping mess of bone, muscle, and flesh, where her stomach should have been, spread-eagled on the windshield like a Dali-esque crucifixion canvas. "Mama," Terry said tremulously. Marilyn turned to tell her to be quiet, and then her blood turned to ice in her veins. Behind the girl, framed in the side window, was the monster, its face frozen in an almost rictus grin, drool dripping from its teeth, its bulbous black head dully reflecting the dim strip lights far above in the ceiling. It lifted a skeletal hand and tapped on the glass with one vicious black claw. Little pig, let me in or I'll blow your house down," Marilyn thought easily. Then the beast shrieked like a tormented soul from the depths of hell, leaned back, and slammed its head against the side window. The toughened glass warped but held. The creature repeated the move as Marilyn hauled Therese out of the footwell and backed up against the other door. A third time, and a hairline fracture appeared in the glass. "Mama, hush, little flower." The monster headbutted the window once more, and a spider web of cracks rippled out. It would only take one more blow. Marilyn wrapped her arm around Therese. "When I say so, little flower, push backward, okay?" The creature slammed into the glass, and it shattered inward, the beast howling a cry of triumph. It held onto the window with both clawed hands, pushed itself back with its feet, then launched forward, jaws wide open, screeching. Marilyn's fingers closed around the door handle, and she pulled, pushing herself back. "Now!" The door flung open, and they tumbled backward as the monster folded itself into the cab, occupying the space they had just vacated. Marilyn leapt to her feet and slammed the door closed, then grabbed Therese's arm and pulled her down onto the floor, rolling them both under the adjacent truck and then out the other side, repeating the maneuver until there were 2 rows of vehicles between them and the creature. She heard the monster howling and put a finger to her lips. Therese nodded solemnly. What was best? Try to make it back to the main colony buildings, or make a run for the retractable door to the outside? The creature howled again, louder this time. It was out of the vehicle. She beckoned for Therese to follow and crawled on her hands and knees to the end of the row of trucks, where there was a stack of fuel drums. Could she perhaps trap the monster under them? Cause them to explode? With what? Then she saw something by the drums. The rifle that the woman had carried. It was maybe 6 meters away, across open ground. Could she make it in time? She looked at Therese, put her finger to her lips again, and patted the concrete floor, indicating that the girl should stay put. Therese hugged Pinky Punk and nodded, but Marilyn could see the terror in her eyes. She kissed the top of her daughter's head and then crouched by the wheel of the truck, eyes on the gun.
Okay.
Run or crawl. She decided speed was more important than stealth, took a deep breath, and launched herself forward. Marilyn had just closed her hand around the gun when Therese screamed. Marilyn's strength deserted her as she turned to see the creature crouched over her daughter, one of its claws wrapped around her throat. She felt as though she couldn't move, that she could almost sleep. Her mind was shutting down. Her body was deserting her. No, thought Marilyn, no, not today. Letting loose a howl to match the creature's own, one torn from a deeper, more damned circle of Hades, she raised the gun and set off at a run toward it as it looked up at her. Letting her momentum carry her forward, she slid down to her ass and alongside her daughter, ramming the barrel of the gun into the secondary dripping mouth that was emerging from the monster's gaping jaws. "Fuck you, you piece of shit," Marilyn said through gritted teeth, and she pulled the trigger. The pulse blast momentarily illuminated the black and red interior of the creature's mouth before it blew off the back of its helmet-like head. It issued a gargling shriek, then toppled backward in a pool of sizzling ichor that started to bubble and smoke and eat through the concrete of the garage floor. "Mama," Therese said. "Mama, you killed the monster for me." Marilyn finally allowed herself to breathe and hugged her daughter tight. The tears finally came, ripped out of her by the horror and relief and realization of what she had just done. "That's all right, little flower," Marilyn sobbed into Therese's hair. "That's exactly what mamas are for." 10 minutes later, having transferred their bags to another truck, Marilyn drove the vehicle up to the big retractable doorway that opened onto the outside. She headed toward where the huge storage tanks for the oil and ore were located, half a kilometer out from the main colony buildings. She didn't know what her plans were, other than to get out of here and buy herself time to think. They had maybe enough food for 3 or 4 days. Perhaps in that time proper help might come. All she had to do was stay put out there on the edge of the terraformed sector and hope to God those monsters didn't decide to go walkabout outside the colony buildings. "Don't leave me, Mama," Therese said as Marilyn put the vehicle in neutral and opened the door. "It's okay," she said. "I'm just opening the doors to let us out. Then we're going on an adventure, all right, little flower?" Therese nodded doubtfully, and Marilyn let herself down onto the concrete, scanning around for any more creatures, the gun in her hand. She ran over to the wall and slapped the big button that worked the door. As it started to tremble up, letting in a blast of cold air and rain from the outside, Marilyn started to head back to the truck, only to see Therese in the window, waving frantically at her. Her heart pounding, Marilyn spun around, her gun up, as the door rolled up to reveal a figure standing framed in the dim, late afternoon light. It was a woman, tall, with long dreadlocks falling over the shoulders of her jacket. She had a pulse rifle trained on Marilyn. "Okay, sister, drop the gun," the woman said. "You're coming with me." "Monsters," Tom Moran said doubtfully. "I fucking saw it," Bromley said. "It ripped Amina to pieces." She nodded toward the French woman, huddled with her daughter in the corner of the comms tower. "She blew its fucking brains out." "We need to get off this planet," the woman, Marilyn something, said in perfect English. "These things are all over the colony." "And that's what killed all the colonists," Moran said. "And Frank." "Your friend, the man?" "Yes," Marilyn said. "Your ship is working, yes? We can leave." He thought about it for a bit. "We have orders to stay. LV-187 has been claimed for New Albion. We're just waiting for relief." "That's what your friend said," Marilyn replied sourly, "just before he died." "If we're going to go, then we should think about it soon." Boffin was standing by the big observation window, watching the dusk fall. Rain was battering against the glass. "There's a storm coming in, a big one. It'll be impossible to fly soon." "It'll take the comms out too," Marilyn said. "We get big storms here, bad ones. So we go now, yes?" "Gov," Bromley said, seeing his hesitation. "It was a fucking monster. It killed Amina and Priestley." "Maybe not the same one," Marilyn said. Moran looked at her. How many of these things are there? I don't know. Maybe a dozen? Maybe more. They were difficult to count when they were slaughtering us all. Yet you survived, Moran said. And you killed one. So maybe they're not that big a deal after all. I'm a fucking scientist, the woman spat. Do not underestimate me. Boffin chuckled behind Moran. Maybe I should call this in, he said. We won't get an answer back before the storm hits, Boffin said. Look, Gov, if what they're saying is true, we're no good to New Albion as dead heroes, are we? Should I go and at least prep the Victory for takeoff? Okay. Moran decided that couldn't do any harm. I'll call it in anyway. The military needs to know about this shit. Thank God, the woman said, holding her small child close. And thank you. Walking through the hangar that led to the landing platform, Boffin found a rack of waterproof coats and wrapped himself in one before stepping out into the failing daylight. The sky was roiling with black clouds, marbled with snakes of lightning. The temperature had dropped a good 8 or 9 degrees since he was last outside. The Victory sat squatly on the landing platform, the access steps down as he'd left them. He should have closed them up when he came up last time. The inside would be soaked. The wind almost took him off his feet as he ran across the slick platform toward the ship. Careful now, he thought. Don't want to end up like that dead Frenchie we shot when we first arrived. It's a long way down off the platform. Monsters, though. It was burning to see that corpse in the garage for himself. Maybe they could grab a quick look before taking off. He'd heard the stories, of course, about the border bombings, this black goo raining down on the distant remote colonies. One guy had told him that if this black goo hit you, it turned you inside out. And if you were downwind of it, then it changed you, mutated you, made you into something else. Monsters, maybe. Is that what had happened here? Boffin hauled himself up the steps and closed the access hatch behind him. Water pooled on the floor of the deck. He'd have to mop that up, but later. He'd better get the Victory prepped for takeoff. He was with Bromley on this. They'd done their bit. Flying flags was one thing. Fighting monsters was something entirely different. Boffin settled himself in the cockpit and began the preliminary checks. Rain battered the windshield. The storm was coming in a lot faster than the computers had predicted. They were really going to have to get off this rock very quickly. He opened a comms channel to the colony, but got only static. He wondered if Moran had managed to get a message off-world. Everything looked in order, which was no surprise because the Victory was a good little ship. They could be ready for takeoff in minutes. He tried the comms link again, but there was still nothing. In fact, the static hiss was worse. He'd have to go out and brave the storm again to get the rest of them down here. Boffin flipped off the comms link. There was still a faint hissing sound. He frowned. It wasn't coming from the comms deck. It was coming from behind him. Boffin slowly turned his head and screamed. Anything? That was Bromley, the woman who captured them at the garage. Nothing, her boss Moran replied in disgust. Storm's totally knocked out the comms. It always happens, Marilyn said. Storm might last all night, maybe even all of tomorrow. It was one of the many pleasures of living on LV-187. One of the reasons they were pretty much forgotten by everyone else until it was time to send a nice big shipment of oil off for use on the other ICSC colony worlds. Moran turned to her. You think we're going to be able to take off? She looked out through the window. Visibility was practically zero now. Under normal circumstances, she'd say no, it wasn't safe at all. But they had this very small, rapidly narrowing window of opportunity to get the hell off LV-187, and she wasn't sure she could bear to pass it up. Moran was already on the comms again. Boffin! Come in, Boffin! We prepped for takeoff yet? He swore as he got nothing but a static hiss. Okay, Maybe we should just go. Guff, Bromley said. Incoming. He joined her at the window, and Marilyn went over to look as well. Just emerging from the black clouds was a bank of lights. It was a ship. Your New Albion military, she said. Moran squinted into the growing darkness. It looks a bit small for an army vehicle. Tisha, try hailing them. Bromley stood at the comms hub, and after a couple of minutes shouted, Nothing, Gov! As it got closer, the ship revealed itself to be a small personal cruiser, swinging and buffeting in the high winds as it entered a landing program, swooping and ducking as it tried to align itself with the platform. With a sinking heart, Marilyn knew that the weather was too bad to even attempt to take off. She didn't even know if this ship, whoever was in it, was going to be able to land. Oh, bollocks, Moran said. You know who it is? Those idiots who requested landing permission earlier. What was the ship called? The Elvic? That's a skilled pilot, Bromley said admiringly as the ship rolled, then straightened, then swung in the wind and rain, positioning itself over the landing platform. The Elvic hovered just 10 meters above the platform and started its reverse thrusters, slowly descending. Moran had been right, Marilyn thought. They were idiots for coming here. Now they were going to be trapped until the storm cleared as well. More people to die. Just 3 meters from touching down, the Elvic was suddenly slammed by a gale-force burst of wind that twisted it, flinging it to one side, bringing it crashing down the final 2 meters. Its starboard flank and engine smashed hard into the landing platform with a shriek of rending metal and an explosion of fuel. 13. Thank you for flying, Air Davis. We apologize for the rough landing and the damage to our craft that has apparently trapped us on a xenomorph-infested planet in the middle of a raging storm. The time on LV-187 is 6 p.m. GMT, and local conditions are murderous with approaching slaughter. Still not fucking funny, Chad said, picking himself up off the cockpit floor. Starboard engine sit right. Not irreparable. The dog stared for a while at the mainframe display. Fuel burn wasn't critical, but we're not leaving anytime soon. Chad helped a chair up to her feet. You okay? Yeah, she nodded, then winced. Ow. Think I bruised my ass, but still alive. Chad looked out of the cockpit at the colony buildings, gray against the black sky. They were all dark apart from a slim needle on the east side, not far from the landing pad. Probably the comms tower, where there were lights blazing in the top stories. Best guess, that's where they're holed up, he said. I wonder if it started yet. Hey, Chair said. There's another ship over there. The Victory, Davis responded. The New Albion trade ship that put down here and claimed LV-187. At least there's a way off here if things really deteriorate. So what do we do now? Chair said. We go in there and get a good look at these things? Confirm what happened here? She's still treating this like some kind of safari, Chad thought. Nobody could understand the xenomorphs until they saw them for themselves. Not really. And most people who did see them didn't survive to tell the tale. That couldn't happen with Chair Hunt. She had to do what Chad couldn't. Tell everyone else about them and Weyland-Yutani's complicity in their existence. So what they wouldn't be doing was heading off all gung-ho into the colony and offer themselves up as a xenomorph buffet. Nope. We wait, Chad said, until someone from inside comes out to get us. Then we'll know it's safe. Or at least that there's a safe harbor somewhere inside. In that case, what are we going to do in the meantime? Chair said, sounding exasperated. Gather around the campfire and tell tall tales, Davis declared. Chad frowned. Davis was getting increasingly erratic, maybe? Ever since he decided he needed a sense of humor, it was as if he devoted too much processing power to the task. That AI has been a dog for far too long, he thought. He's never going to achieve his holy grail of humanity he craves while he's padding around on all fours. Well, if we're done story time, Chair said, settling into the cockpit seat and spinning it around to face Chad. Let's have the one about how you won a spaceship and a robot dog and a game of cards. Previously. Some thought that the LV designation given to colony worlds meant life viable. But to the conglomeration of businesses, entrepreneurs, and organized crime families who set up LV-222 out on the fringes, it was a revenue stream. Pretty soon after they'd established the first free port, not under the authority of the United Americas, the Three World Empire, the Union of Progressive Peoples, the Independent Core Systems colonies, or, in fact, anyone, everybody started calling the place Las Vegas. Chad McLaren found himself there on the trail of the crew of a trading ship that, so rumor on gossip, on hearsay had it, possessed the corpse of a xenomorph. They were offering it for sale, along with the Weyland-Yutani go-between, who had been very keen to take it off their hands. By the time he got there, the trail was cold. Or it had been a red herring all along. He was carrying Davis around in little more than a portable hard drive, which was entirely frustrating for the AI. Chad, Davis would whisper into his earphones, can you imagine being stuck in a dark, black, infinite box? I was made as a combat synthetic. I could touch and see and smell and hear. This is torture. Please get me a body. Somehow get me a body. The fact was, carrying Davis around in his pocket made it a damned sight easier for him to get around. Weyland-Yutani had placed a price on his head, and he'd had more than one narrow escape that would have been an awful lot more difficult had he been teamed up with a humanoid synthetic. Still, he sympathized with Davis. They'd been through a lot together and were united not just in their war on xenomorphs and Weyland-Yutani, but also in loss. Chad had lost Amanda, and Davis had lost Zula Hendricks. Or at least they were parted, and no one knew where Zula was, so it was the same thing. On Las Vegas, while he didn't find a pirate crew with a xenomorph corpse to sell, Weyland-Yutani found him. Las Vegas was policed by crooks and populated by cheats, liars, and thieves. So he wasn't hugely surprised when he returned to the port on the day he wanted to leave, to find that his ship had been impounded. He didn't wait around long enough to find out who or why, but he knew Weyland-Yutani would be behind it. So he ducked into the nearest casino and considered his next move. His next move was, it turned out, finding out to his surprise that he was very, very good at poker. It was a matter of assessing all of the variables and determining the best way to proceed. Either that or he was very, very lucky. Over the course of 6 hours, he built up enough of a pot to force the brash young scion of a crime family that ran 3 colony worlds in the sector to put his neat little cruiser up as collateral for a hand the kid was sure was unbeatable. It wasn't. Chad was just about to walk away with the keys when the casino fell into a hush, and a stately old woman with a high beehive hairdo and a grand cocktail dress was pushed in on a wheelchair by a brace of tuxedo-wearing gorillas, a cute brown dog by her side. My grandson wants his toy back, the woman drawled in a dry Southern American accent. You know boys and their toys. I won it fair and square, Chad protested. His way off Las Vegas about to be taken away from him, probably with a few punches to the gut for good measure. That you did, the grand old dame agreed, and I intend to win it back from you, fair and square. She was wheeled to the table and said, What would you have me stake against the Elvic? Chad, Davis whispered in his ear. The dog. It's a synthetic. Very good work. Black market wet job. Never seen anything like it. Dorothea Whitaker had with her 3 goons packing weapons beneath their suit jackets, and a thin, bespectacled man with a sheen of sweat on his forehead and bloodless lips he was constantly licking. He noticed Chad inspecting the dog. You are admiring my handiwork. Chad disliked the man immediately. Dorothea tutted benignly. Mr. Higgs here takes every opportunity to boast about his craft. He is one of the finest synthetic technicians in this sector. She glanced at him mildly. He could have been the finest in any sector, save for certain unsavory proclivities. Fortunately, my operation is a very broad-minded one. Separate the art from the artist, Chad, Davis cautioned. This is an exact replica of my beloved Jasper, Dorothea continued, looking with love at the dog. It fulfilled its programming by returning her gaze with adoring big eyes. He died 3 years ago. I was quite distraught. Mr. Higgs here gave Jasper back to me. Synthetic production and deployment was carefully controlled by the authorities, but the fact remained that any legitimate technology would, sooner or later, be co-opted by the underground. The sex industry led the charge, of course, and no doubt Mr. Higgs had experience with that. But a surprisingly popular byproduct of that was facsimile pets created for the very, very wealthy. I'll stake the Elvic against your dog, Chad said. The old woman bristled. Higgs seemed unaccountably delighted that his work was the focus of such fierce competition. I can make you another one if you lose, he said through his thin, wet lips. Dorothea narrowed her eyes. I won't lose. One hand of cards later, Chad walked out of the casino with the keys to the Elvic in one hand and a leash in the other, on the end of which trotted Davis's brand new synthetic body. Neither of them hung around Las Vegas long enough to find out what would happen if the Georgia Mafia decided to up the stakes and demand a rematch. That was a lot funnier than I was expecting, Cher said. You didn't strike me as the sort of guy who tells shaggy dog stories. Life can't all be running around trying to not get killed, Chad said, and he shrugged. Were you hoping for something more appropriate to a dark and stormy night? As if on cue, a strong wind buffeted the Elvic. Cher looked out of the window. Some storm, all right. What do you think they're doing in there? Probably wondering what we're doing in here, Chad said. Davis, any chatter on the comms? Nothing, the synthetic replied, accessing the system through the tech that allowed him to speak. The storms knocked everything out, even short range. I wouldn't worry about that, Cher said, squinting through the rain lashing the windscreen. I think things are about to get up close and personal. What the fuck are they doing out there? Moran said, shielding his eyes from his own reflection against the observation window in the comms tower. Maybe they didn't survive the landing, Bromley suggested. They came down pretty heavily. Maybe good for them if they didn't, Marilyn said. Moran ignored her. Where the fuck is Boffin? He's been in the ship forever. He made a decision. Right, I'm going out there to see what's going on with him, and I'll bring whoever's in that ship back up here. Proceeding to the hangar, he dragged on one of the waterproof coats and let himself out onto the landing platform. Moran immediately threw himself back into the building, unprepared for the ferocity of the winds and the driving rain. Christ, it was like a bloody hurricane, and he thought the weather on New Albion was crap. He pitied the poor sods who had to come and live here permanently when all this was over. Bracing himself against the howling wind, he tried again, leaning in toward the gale and pushing forward through the almost horizontal rain. The Victory was dark, aside from the faint glow of the instrument panel in the cockpit. Had Boffin decided to take a nap in the middle of all this? A faint part of him hoped that was the case. There was absolutely no chance anyone was taking off in this weather, so Moran wanted everyone inside where he could see them. First, he'd find out who was in this new ship. Then he'd get Boffin. Wiping the rain from his face, he peered toward the Elvic. 2 figures in the cockpit window as far as he could tell. He waved his pulse rifle at them so they knew he'd seen them, but also so they knew he was armed. Moran moved around to the side of the ship and watched the hatch slide open. The 2 figures emerged to the lip of the entrance. It was a man, tall and stocky, and a woman with dark hair and olive skin, I told you not to land, Moran shouted. The man replied, but the wind whipped his words away. What? How many dead? The man shouted. What? Moran called back. The entire fucking colony is dead. How many? The man began, but the storm swallowed his last word. How many what? Xenomorphs. Aliens. What? Monsters, the man shouted. Moran wiped the rain from his face. I think you better come down. Chad gave Chair a padded coat, then unlocked a cabinet on the flight deck and handed her a pistol. Can you hide this anywhere? This guy's going to try to take them off us, I'm sure, but I'm not going on there without weapons. Chair slid it into the back of her trousers and watched as Chad did the same. Rather than the ramp, they extended the disembarkation ladders and carefully descended into the howling storm, Chad with Davis in his arms. You brought a fucking dog, the man said, waiting for them on the rain-swept landing platform. He held out his hand. Tom Moran of the New Albion trade ship Victory. We saw you on TV, Chair said, taking the hand. I'm Chair Hunt. This is Chad McLaren and the dog is Davis. What was that word you said before? Moran said to Chad, loudly enough to be heard clearly. That thing you call them. Xenomorphs, Chad shouted. Have you got a secure area inside? We should get in. Moran nodded and pointed to the other ship. I just need to get my crew member. He was prepping the Victory for takeoff, but nobody's going anywhere in this storm. Moran pushed against the wind to the ship and was just about to hit the panel on the outside to open the door and bring down the steps when Chad put a hand on his arm. Wait, he said. Look. Chair followed Chad's outstretched arm and peered at the cockpit window. There was indeed something strange about it. Half of the windshield darker than the rest. The closer she looked, the more it looked like blood, she said. Moran was pulling away from Chad's grip and going for the control panel again. Blood! Chair shouted. Don't open it! Boffin's in there, Moran said. He began to yell. Boffin! Boffin! Jerry! You okay in there? Something else appeared at the window. Holy fuck, Jerry whispered to the storm. She had seen the photographs. She had made notes. Endless, relentless notes, recording every single detail as described by Chad and Davis. She knew the life cycle inside out and back to front, knew the heights to which they grew, and the radius of their mouths, and the potency of their acid blood. Like all journalists, Chair had become an instant expert in her subject through immersion and obsession. She had pushed less important things out of her head and filled those spaces with xenomorph facts and figures and lore. When her story was written, the details would be discarded, room made for the next topic. But for now, she knew everything she needed to know about them. Or so she had thought. No amount of research, of questioning, of interviewing, of assimilation of the facts could have prepared her for what appeared at the window of the Victory. She had an idea it was some kind of animal, an alien, unknown, deadly animal, but a creature born of some kind of logic and evolution. That wasn't what she was looking at. This was a nightmare, a haunting, a thing carved from night and drenched in death. It had been dragged from hell and clothed in armor, its sinews taut like the strings of a musical instrument on which only overtures of pain could be played. It was a demon, a djinn, a spirit, a fury. It was horror, from the tip of its segmented tail to the drool-dripping point of its sharpest tooth. It was a xenomorph. I had no fucking idea. Chad was dragging Moran away from the ship. Leave it, he shouted. Leave it! If your friend was in there, he's dead. We need to get inside or we're going to end up the same way. Moran looked from Chad to Chair and back again. "Who are you people?" he said. "Your best chance of getting off this rock alive," Chad said, and the four of them hurried against the raging storm toward the dark colony buildings. 14. The storm raged and redoubled its efforts, and raged all the more. Marilyn could swear that she felt the solid concrete comms tower sway in the wind of knives that assaulted the colony. She'd never known a storm this bad in all her time on LV-187. It was as if the planet knew it harbored death of the most final sort, and wanted to mark the occasion with all that it could muster. There were 7 of them now, including the dog. Her and Therese, Moran and Bromley, and the newcomers, Chad McLaren, Chair Hunt, and Davis, who was sitting patiently while Therese petted him and whispered to him in the corner. At least the animal gave her daughter some respite from the horror, distracted her from what the grown-ups were talking about. "Tell me again," Moran said. Chad took a breath and repeated his story for the entire group. They had a name, the monsters. Xenomorphs. They existed merely to kill and to reproduce. The longer any humans stayed on LV-187, the more xenomorphs there would be. They would eventually be overwhelmed, either slaughtered outright or worse, become breeding vessels for the beasts. "Where are they from?" Bromley demanded. Chad shrugged. "Extraterrestrial in origin, we think. We don't know where their homeworld is. We also don't know what part and to what extent whaling time has had in their development and evolution." "They've killed 3 of my crew," Moran said, "and all the colonists apart from her and her kid." He pointed at Marilyn. "But they're not indestructible, are they? She killed one." Chad looked at Marilyn with interest. "You did? How?" "I put a gun in its mouth and blew his head off." He nodded, visibly impressed. "That takes guts." "My daughter was in danger," Marilyn said with a shrug. She looked over to Therese, who was whispering in the dog's ear. "You won't tell, will you? It will be our secret." Marilyn wanted to ask, but held back. The girl had seen so much, so many things no child should see. When they got off here, she was going to need to have therapy, counseling, to get over what she had been through. So was Marilyn. She was keeping it together for the sake of her child, and because to fall apart would mean certain death. "So, what do we do now?" Moran said. "Your ship is a bust. Mine's got a bloody xenomorph in it. Not that we can take off in this storm. And we've no idea how long it's going to last. Help is on its way from New Albion, but if we can't get off, then they can't get down." "I don't think help is on its way," Chad said, and Moran and Bromley stared at him. "What are you talking about?" the woman said. "Of course they're sending someone." Chad looked at his companion, Chair. "We think it's possible this whole thing was orchestrated by New Albion," she explained. "These things hatch from eggs. A trader ship carrying such eggs was recently boarded in the planet's vicinity. Everyone on board was killed and the vessel crashed in a remote area of New Albion. The ovomorphs, eggs, were taken. We think New Albion deliberately placed them here to kill all the colonists so that they could claim the deserted colony for themselves." "Is this true?" Marilyn glared at Moran. "Is this why you are here? Is this why everyone is dead?" Moran held up his hands. "Lady, look. 3/5 of my crew is dead too. You think I'd come down here if this was true? Which, incidentally, I don't think it is." Marilyn believed him, at least about the part of him not knowing about it. She was quite certain that New Albion was more than capable of such a plot. Was sure that any government would be. "Thing is, I don't really think New Albion knew what they were playing with," Chad said. "They might have heard whispers about xenomorphs and put 2 and 2 together with the rumors about the border bombings and come up with the notion that they had some kind of bioweapon on their hands. But I don't believe they knew the full extent of what they were unleashing on LV-187. They'll be keeping a watching brief to see exactly what happens here." They sent us down, Bromley said doubtfully. Chad shrugged. They needed to raise the flag. You got the job. They'll be remembered as heroes of the new British Empire. Probably posthumously, I'm afraid. Chad, Cher said quietly, motioning to Therese. He's fine, Marilyn said. She's seen what everyone else has seen. She needs to know the facts about what we're facing as much as everyone else does. She looked at Cher, who had said she was a journalist on Earth. So you do not think anyone will come to our aid? Nobody cares about what happens here. Everybody cares about what happens here, Cher said. According to the news feeds, just before we made planetfall, LV-187 is at the center of a major interstellar incident. Since New Albion announced its secession, the three-world empire has formally cut all diplomatic and defense ties with the colony. That goes for any colonies that support it, too. According to unsubstantiated reports, there are a number of them in the Wayland Isles, with a variety of allegiances, who are sympathetic with New Albion's move. The ICSC is being more aggressive. They've made a formal declaration of war against New Albion over what it says is the invasion of LV-187. That said, the ICSC declared war on the United Americas after the Hasanova incident. Whether they have the balls to follow it through remains to be seen. They haven't with the inlay. What the United Americans doing? Moran said. Like New Albion, keeping a watching brief, Cher said. There were some who thought they might move against the ICSC, given their state of war and support New Albion. They're twitchy about some of their own colonies who are making noise about secession in the wake of Maurice Pepper's announcement. So the best we can hope for is that the ICSC sends a ship to retake LV-187, Chad said, and if they can get us off-world before we all get killed. There was silence while they all thought about it for a moment, as the storm howled outside. So what do we do in the meantime? Moran said. Try to stay alive, Chad said. He looked at Marilyn. Are we sure there aren't any more surviving colonists? There was one, but they shot him, Marilyn said, gesturing toward Moran. Hey, that was an accident. Chad looked around the comms room. This isn't a bad defensive position. Minimal roof space above us, which is good. We need to secure every single hatch and duct vent in the room. What about supplies and weapons? They all put down their guns and rifles on the central counter. Marilyn hesitated, then laid down her kitchen knife. We have supplies in the ship, Moran said, but that's off limits unless we can kill that critter. We have some, Chad said. Kitchen and food stores? Far side of the colony, Marilyn said. We were holed up there before the New Albion ship came. There are tin goods and water. Chad nodded. Let's try to avoid leaving here unless we have to. These things, Marilyn said. These xenomorphs. What would they be doing now? Chad glanced at Therese, then back at her mother. They probably formed a hive. There might well be a queen. There's a very good chance not all of your fellow colonists are dead. Yet. Some of them might be incubating xenomorph embryos. But don't get up any hope. If they're not dead, they soon will be. They'll be coming for us, Raleigh said, picking up the pulse rifle. Chad nodded. They'll be coming for us. We have to be ready. The crack of thunder sounded right above them, shaking the comms tower, and the lights flickered. Marilyn beckoned Therese over to her and held her very tightly. Frank Priestley wasn't dead. For the first 6 hours, he'd wished he was, but not now. His body was a symphony of agony, every nerve ending singing a torturer's lament. He could only see through one eye, and his face was raw and stinging, his throat as dry as a desert. He was in darkness, save for the thinnest of lights emanating from he didn't know where. Suspended, trapped against the wall by a resinous spiderweb of hardened fibers crisscrossing him like scar tissue. He didn't know where he was, other than it was hot, unbearably hot. And he didn't care anymore. He had been chosen. When the creature had taken him in the corridor, he had thought he was in the presence of the very devil himself. But as it dragged him along the access tunnels in the ceiling, he realized that it wasn't the devil. It was merely one of the foot soldiers of hell. The true devil was waiting for him in the hive. She was magnificent. He had lost consciousness for a long time, and when he awoke, there was something covering his face, something soft and pliable, yet hard and skeletal at the same time. It had put something down his throat which allowed him to breathe in a raspy, labored way, and he felt something happening to him deep inside. While he was unconscious, the thing covering his face must have fallen away. It was gone when he woke. There were others, too. Other humans spiderwebbed to the walls just like he was, covered in a goo of cells and protein and bile from the guts of the monsters themselves. At first it made him wrench, but then he realized what it was and why it covered him. It was mucus. It was meconium. It was the slime of rebirth. Frank Priestley was being changed. He was shedding his old self. He was being remade. He was being reborn. He had been chosen. Some of the other people moaned faintly, or in more lucid moments screamed and begged. Frank Priestley did not beg. He was not weak like them. He recognized that whatever was inside him was changing him, altering him, improving him. All his life, Frank Priestley had longed to be a part of something bigger. That was why he had emigrated to New Albion. That was why he had signed up with the Trade Corps. That was why he had applied to join the Duke of Wellington's. Frank Priestley felt safety in numbers, preferred it when he was part of a consensus, liked it when he didn't have to think for himself. This was better than any army or brotherhood. Frank Priestley felt a part of something, felt it growing within him. He hadn't had to beg to join them. He had been chosen. Through his one good eye, he saw movement in the wide subterranean space. There were moans of fear from those still alive around him, the stench of terror. But Frank was not afraid. He rejoiced. His heart sang. He felt joy flood his very being as the shape rose, 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 filling the cavernous space. No, more than joy, love. She was a thing of beauty, a goddess, a being of ineffable purity and truth. She was a queen, and a queen deserved pomp and circumstance when she chose to move among her subjects. Huge and magnificent, she shone blackly, moving fluidly like the river Styx flowing through Hades. She drew herself up to her full height and turned her huge dome of a head, inspecting those that belonged to her. A snatch of poetry from his school days flitted through his head. She walks in beauty like the night, of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright is in her aspect and her eyes. She seemed to test the air, the very pheromones on the still, hot, heavy breaths of her subjects. She deserved more than this mewling and moaning. She deserved music and song. Frank opened his mouth and gasped, then tried to maneuver saliva around his sand-dry mouth. Eventually, he began to croak a paean of honor to her. "God save our gracious queen," he grunted. "Long live our noble queen. God save the queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the queen." Her huge, bulbous head paused in its sweeping of the hive, cocked to one side as if considering him. She drew closer, her fetid breath anointing him with foul spittle. He reveled in her attention. The queen lifted up a massive claw and drew its sharp point down the raw, ragged flesh of his ruined face. He gasped in agony and ecstasy at her touch. Then she presented her hand to him, and he leaned forward as best he could, and kissed it. She hissed and screeched and drew back. At first he thought he had offended her, and awaited her righteous rage. Her claws outstretched, she paused in front of his face for a moment, then slashed at either side of him. He felt the resinous bonds weaken and stretch, and then snap as she raked her claws over him. His helpless body sagged, and then fell to the floor at her feet. Frank looked up at her. Was she about to deliver a fatal blow? No. She regarded him silently, waiting. He realized what was happening. She had a design for him, a plan. He was to do her bidding for the glory of the hive. Among all the chosen, Frank had been elevated, had been doubly chosen. "Thank you," he gasped. She hissed at him. She did not want his gratitude. That was a human thing, a failing, a weakness, and there was no place for that in the hive. She merely needed his complete and total obedience. The colonist stuck to the wall beside him opened her eyes. "Aidez-moi, s'il vous plaît," she whispered. "Aidez-moi." Frank could not help her, could not help anyone, could not even help himself. He was enthralled to his queen, and he could do no more or no less than what she demanded. As if to prove his point, the queen bent low, hissing at the colonist who had spoken, and raked her claws viciously across the woman's face, silencing her with finality. Then she brought her head close to Frank's and bared her teeth. "Yes," Frank hoarsely said. "I understand. I won't fail you." Then, adrenaline flooding his ruined, battered body, he spun around and half crawled, half ran away from the charnel house of the hive and back to the land of the living. 15. Cher sat silently in the corner of the comms deck and watched the others going around every inch of the walls and floors, duct taping over vents and service hatches. They found a set of welding tools and bolt guns in a cabinet, and were securing pieces of metal stripped from around the comms console to anything that might allow even the slightest ingress to the circular room. She was beginning to feel claustrophobic, desirous not just of air, but the specific, sweet-smelling, honey-golden, late-fall air of an Oregon dusk, where the land seemed to roll on forever into the encroaching darkness, and the sun blinked below the horizon with the promise that it would be back in the morning. Thinking of that made her think of old man Nesbitt's grain silo, and Shy dangling 15 meters up, and the sick feeling in the pit of Cher's stomach, and the tingling in the soles of her feet as she knew, with a sinking heart, that she couldn't go up to help her sister. "You are not the story," one of her journalism tutors, Professor Schmidt, had said to them time and time again. "You are not the story." Cher had made a mantra of it too, and always reported the news from a respectful distance, letting events unfold at their own pace and giving other people their voices. She never went up the grain silo, any grain silo. It wasn't her place to do so. All she wanted to know was how the people were feeling, who were hanging by the tips of their fingers, 15 meters up. You are not the story. And yet here she was. The story. How are you feeling? She asked herself. That was what she'd asked 1,000 times in her career, of people who were bereaved or dispossessed or injured or lost. How are you feeling? It was a stupid question because it was obvious to anyone watching how this person or that person was feeling in the midst of tragedy and horror. And yet, unless the question was asked, very often the answer wasn't forthcoming. People didn't usually say without prompting how they were feeling. So you had to ask the stupid question to get the right answer. Chair pulled her knees up and hugged them and asked herself again, how are you feeling? Scared, she told herself. Numb. Like it all wasn't really happening and she was watching it with a detached air on some entertainment channel. Then scared again. Terrified. And in a little corner of herself, somewhat elated. Excited. With that shiver of hairs on the back of her neck that always signaled being at the heart of a really big story. How are you feeling? Like kind of a fucking story. Suck on that, Professor Schmidt. Are you all right? A voice said in her ear. It was Davis, sitting upright, head tilted to one side. Mama! Mama! The little French girl said. Thérèse, who had stopped what she was doing, piling up a pyramid of duct tape rolls, to stare at Davis. The dog talked. Hush, little flower, Marilyn said, crouched down by an air vent and shooting big bolts into the corners of a square of aluminum. Cher wished she was being as useful as the colonist. Dogos don't talk. This one does, Cher said, smiling as best she could. She liked this Marilyn. She was tough and no-nonsense, yet tender and loving, too. She wanted to be her. He's a synthetic carrying a rather special AI called Davis. Marilyn stared at her and stood up, frowning. She beckoned Thérèse over. Do not bother the lady and the dog, little flower, the woman said to her daughter, pretty coldly in Cher's opinion. Stay by me. Maybe she doesn't like synthetics, Cher murmured to Davis. Many people don't, Davis said quietly back. Sometimes we went wrong in the early days. People are still a little scared of what they don't fully understand, because what they don't really understand they can't properly trust. Perhaps that's why humans are always fighting goddamn wars, Cher said. Nobody seems to understand anybody else, ever. This will cheer you up, Davis said. Have you learned a new joke? No. I just calculated our chances of survival. Cher pulled her face. Maybe not, huh? I'd rather this not be a numbers game. Fair enough. Davis trotted over to the big observation window and jumped up, putting his front paws on the sill so he could look out at the relentless storm. Cher climbed to her feet and joined him, looking at their reflections in the dark glass. I wish Zula were here, Davis said. Kick-ass broad, right? Cher said. Definitely. I've never seen a braver woman. A braver human. She has done things that a synthetics programming would rail against because of the apparent stupidity of it. But she did it for others. Fearless, Cher said, half to herself. I wish I was like that. She saw Davis's reflection look up at her. Fearless? No. Only an idiot has no fear, he said. It's how you conquer it that makes you brave. Mama, why can't I play with the talking doggo? Thérèse whined. Hush, little flower, just stay by me, Marilyn said. Is it because he's not a real doggo? Marilyn hesitated. This wasn't a conversation she really wanted to have. Why don't you go and get Mama a big roll of duct tape so we can wrap it around this vent, she said. Thérèse toddled off, and Marilyn became aware of someone else standing behind her. It was the journalist, Cher. She gave her a tight smile. Cher crouched down beside her. Your daughter is beautiful. Thank you, Marilyn said. Unusual for a girl of, what is she, 5, 6? Marilyn shot her a look. She's 6. Why do you say unusual? Cher waved a hand vaguely in the air. All this stuff. She's taking it in her stride so much. At that age, I'd have been a quivering wreck, hiding behind my daddy. Marilyn relaxed a little. The woman was just being friendly. Kids are resilient, though, aren't they? She said. I bet you'd have been stronger than you think you would have been. She paused and added, could you hold this plate into place while I bolt the corners? Chair smiled quickly, seemingly keen to be of use. She held the medal with the flaps of her hands and said, Davis is no danger to your daughter, or anyone else. He's a very unusual AI. As far as I can gather, he's got free will. Marilyn looked at her, frowning. How is that possible? Chair shrugged. I don't know. He's an anomaly. She lowered her voice. He's in love with a human woman. How crazy is that? And does she love him back? This synthetic dog? I think so. Chair moved her hands away as Marilyn finished bolting the panel. I'm not quite sure where she is. I don't think anyone knows. But Davis wasn't always a dog. That's a fairly recent turn of events. He started off as a combat droid in humanoid form. Then he was kind of a floating bunch of AI or something. You're not a scientist, are you? Marilyn smiled. No, Chair laughed. I'm not. Are you? Petroleum geologist. That's why I'm here in LV-187. It was meant to be a 3-year posting. She looked at Chair. I'll be asking for one fuck of a bonus when we get back to Earth. Perez brought over a roll of tape, and Marilyn used it to secure the edges of the hatch. That was all the vents done now. She stood up stiffly and surveyed the room where the others were finishing off their jobs. No children yourself, I presume? No, Chair said, too busy with work and never met anyone I liked enough to have children with. They watched as Perez, glancing at her mother, sidled off toward where Davis was still looking out of the window. Marilyn raised an eyebrow at her but gave her the slightest of nods. Neither did I, Marilyn said, but I knew I wanted children. I used a donor. She gazed at Perez across the room. In a way, I wish I had chosen more wisely. She felt Chair's curious stare on her and shook her head. Ignore me. Come on, let's find out what is supposed to happen next. The Chosen walked with impunity along the corridors of death. That was how he thought of himself now. Not Frank Priestley, but the Chosen. It was as if he could barely remember Priestley, could hardly understand his life before. That had been empty and meaningless and without purpose or structure. Now he had a mission, a holy crusade for his queen. Emerging from the bowels of the hive, he assumed an air of his old mortality, but it was merely a flag of convenience, a cloak of deceit. He knew what he was now, as did his queen, as did this drone, crouched in the corridor in front of him, hissing and smelling the air as he approached. The Chosen felt a pang of jealousy when he saw the creature. It was a perfect living machine. Not an ounce of its being wasted. Every beautiful, glistening inch of it devoted to its reasons for being. To kill its enemies and protect its queen, and propagate its kind. He pushed the thought away. Jealousy was an emotion for lesser men, lesser beings than he. This drone might have been blessed with the appearance of their dark mistress, but it was just a soldier when all was said and done. He was the Chosen. He walked carefully toward it, hands outstretched. You know me, he murmured. You know who I am. The drone crouched lower as though getting ready to attack. The Chosen showed no fear. He continued to walk as it put its head first this way, then that, its tail whipping behind it. When he was just a meter away, he bowed his head. The drone bared its teeth and let loose a long, sibilant exhalation. It took a step forward on its skeletal legs, crouched low. A silent agreement passed between them, and the Chosen could sense the heartbeats inside him. He raised his head again. I have work to do, he murmured. Anything? Chad McLaren said. Nothing, Moran responded, turning off the comms desk. The storm's getting worse, and more importantly, we're on backup systems here. Every time we try to make contact, we're using juice that isn't being replenished. He looked at the others, busying themselves with pointless but diverting tasks. He dropped his voice to a low whisper. You want us to be seeing the night with absolutely no power? No lights? Imagine if one of those things got in here. Fair enough, Chad conceded. Moran leaned in. You fought these things, what? How many times? More than I care to remember or count. But you always survived is my point. I did. A lot of people didn't. But these things aren't unstoppable. They're not unkillable. They're just very, very tough, right? I suppose, Chad said doubtfully. But you shouldn't underestimate them. I'm not, Moran said. I'm just determined to get off this rock alive. It's all about perspective, isn't it, Clara? All depends on where you see yourself in the pecking order. You and me, we're the same. We're main characters, protagonists. That's why you always come out on top, and so do I. He looked over to the others. These guys, they're supporting cast. You get what I'm saying? Chad looked at him and shook his head slowly. That sort of thinking is a very quick shortcut to getting yourself killed when dealing with xenomorphs, Moran. There are no heroes in these situations, just survivors. It's the best you can hope for. Moran shrugged. That's not how winners think, McLaren. But hey, it's your funeral. I'll say a prayer for you when I'm back on New Albion. Say what you like. Out of the 7 of us left in this shithole, I think I'm best placed to be your survivor type. A sudden hammering on the doors to the comms deck made everyone jump. Fuck, Moran said. Oh no, it's a monster, Therese said, leaping into her mother's embrace. The hammering continued, followed by an indistinct but very human shouting. Moran flipped on the monitor that showed the security camera feed outside the room and stepped back, swearing. Fuck! It's Priestley, he's alive! Chad joined him at the screen, where a man with a mangled, bloody face was hammering at the door, screaming into the camera. Chad hit the unmute key and the man's voice filled the room. In! Let me in! The fucking thing's going to kill me! Possible, Marilyn said, holding Therese close. I saw the xenomorph kill him. Obviously fucking not, Moran said through gritted teeth. He reached for the door control, but Chad stopped him with a hand on his arm. What are you doing? Moran asked. Look, Chad said, and he pointed. Behind Priestley, there was a figure moving in the dull strip lighting. A thin, hunched, almost ape-like creature that eventually moved into focus behind the man's bobbing, screaming head. Xenomorph, Chad said. Well, get your guns and let me open the fucking door, Moran shouted. On my count of 5. 1. Bromley, Chad, Marilyn, and Cher grabbed their weapons and assembled in front of the door. 2. Please! Priestley's voice came over the monitor. It's coming! Hit the deck when the door's open, Frank, Moran said into a microphone. 3. Come to the fucking chase, Gov! Priestley screamed. Fuck, Moran said. 5. Go! He hit the doors and they slid open, and Priestley dove forward onto the deck, the xenomorph growling and hissing 2 meters behind him. Moran grabbed a gun, leapt forward and started firing. Don't just stare at it, kill it! He yelled as the others opened fire. The xenomorph jerked and twitched in the hail of pulse blasts, thrown back to the floor. As it tried to get to its feet, it took a shot straight in the face, screamed, and fell in a smoking heap. Its acid blood started to bubble and smoke and burn its way down through the floor into the story below. Close the doors! Chad shouted as Moran ran forward and dragged Priestley's prone body into the cause room. Thank you. Thank you. Priestley gasped as Moran turned him over in his arms. I thought I was a woman there, Gov. 16. They'd wrapped Priestley in a blanket, and Bromley, who had some medical training, tried to do something with the razored tatters of his face. You're not going to be winning Olympic gold at archery, mate, she said tenderly. You lost the left eye. Pumping him full of painkillers, she wrapped half of his head in bandages after cleaning the raw wound as best she could. We'll get you fixed up properly when we get back to New Albion. You're going to need skin grafts. She took a step back to appraise her handiwork and added, "Neither will you be getting first prize in any beauty contests. That said, you always were an ugly bugger." Priestley seemed to be processing the words she was saying and responding a beat or two too late, forcing a laugh. Chad frowned. The guy had been through a lot and could be excused for not being in top form, but there was still something strange. He had a deep mistrust of anyone who came up close to xenomorphs and didn't die without killing them. "So it just left you," Chad said again. "Jesus Christ, mate, can you lay off him?" Moran said. "You can see what he's been through. What are you getting at?" "It's okay, Gov," Priestley said. "When that thing dragged me up into the crawl space in the roof, I thought I was dead meat. I was in shock. I couldn't move. I don't know what happened, it just scarpered. I suppose something might have scared it off, maybe." "Xenomorphs don't scare easily," Chad said. "Priestley, you're sure you didn't lose consciousness while you were with the alien? What about eggs? Did you see any eggs?" He held up his hand. "About this tall? Did you see any of those? Might you have blacked out for a while?" Priestley shook his head, gratefully accepting a mug of tea from Marilyn. "Thanks, love." He turned to Chad, and even that movement seemed painful. "I knew if I lost consciousness I was dead. I waited until the thing had gone, and I got back down to the corridor. It took forever, but I crawled to the canteen and found this little nest of blankets in the storeroom. Shot myself full of morphine from my belt and zoned out. But I never blacked out anywhere near those things. Never saw any eggs. When I came to, I made my way back here and came across another one of those monsters. If I hadn't been so close to the comms room, I'd have been dead for sure." Priestley looked around the room. "Boffin still at the ship? And where's Amina? She shouldn't be out there on her own, not with those things." "Both dead," Moran said quietly. "Like we thought you were." Priestley rubbed a hand over his good eye. Fuck. We're getting off this place, Gov. Soon as the storm clears. Look, we've made you a bed of blankets in the corner. Why don't you get some rest? We're going to try to cobble together a meal in a couple of hours." Chad watched Moran and Bromley help their colleague over to the pile of blankets. They might be glad to see their crew member back with them, but for some reason he wasn't quite as convinced as he'd like to be. "I don't like that man, Mama," Therese said. "Hush, little flower," Marilyn said, glancing over to where Priestley was sleeping at the far end of the comms room. The big observation window was rattling in the wind, as though it was coming loose in its fittings. She had never known a storm like it. She had to agree with Therese, remembered the way Priestley looked at her when he had confronted them in the corridor. There was something mean and hungry about him. She had to admit she had felt a little dismayed when he had turned up alive, and she hated herself for the uncharitable thought. Chair came, squatted down by them, and picked up a can of beef stew, peeling the top off it and adding it to the pot with the others. Marilyn had rigged up a makeshift electric ring on which to heat the food. The pot, a repurposed casing unscrewed from one of the comms banks. "We'll eat well tonight," Marilyn said, "but we're going to have to get more supplies from the canteen tomorrow." "I don't relish going out there," Cher said, stirring the stew with a broken length of antenna. "Not after what happened to him." They both looked over to Priestley. "Can I go and talk to the doggo, Mama?" "I suppose," Marilyn said, still a bit uncertainly. When Therese had gone, Cher said, "Can I ask why you don't like divas? Have you had a bad experience with synthetics?" Marilyn shook her head. She was starting to like this American woman, but how could she tell her the truth? It could put Therese in danger, and she would never countenance anything happening to her. She had already told her daughter that it was her mama's job to kill monsters. That went for human monsters, too, and she knew that people were capable given the right push. Just an overprotective mama, I suppose, Marilyn said with a tight smile. It's nothing. Davis seems nice. By way of changing the subject, she added in a low voice, Chad seems to be disappointed by Bruce's return. Sharon nodded, opening some sachets of salt and emptying them into the bubbling stew. He does, and I don't really know why. It's like he doesn't believe the guy, but how do you lie about something like that? One of those things grabs you, you're either dead or you get away. Surely there's no in-between. You should know, you've seen them in action. Marilyn blinked, and she saw the xenomorph in the garage again, holding Therese in its claws like a rag doll, about to deliver the killer blow. How is it nobody knows about these things? She asked. Why aren't we all warned about them? Why aren't we at war with them instead of each other? That's why I'm here, Cher said. Chad and Davis contacted me to try to get the word out. There's been a war against the xenomorphs, but it's been fought in the shadows. Chad wants it out in the open. Cher sighed and rolled her eyes. Stupid old me demanded to see the evidence with my own eyes, though. Wish I'd just taken their word for it now. Suddenly, and without warning even to herself, Marilyn leaned over and gave Cher a hug. And I, for one, am glad that you came, if you won't take that the wrong way. I fear that without your arrival, Therese and myself would not be alive right now. Cher hugged her back. It was good. Nice. She felt safe for the first time in more than a week. Somewhere deep inside of her, a spark lit up the darkness she had carried around for so long. She began to think, to hope, that things might just turn out all right. The Chosen lay with his eye closed, but he did not sleep. He communed. His queen's tendrils reached out, up from the hive, snaking through the dim corridors, tapping and feeling around the doors and taped-up vents until they could worm their way inside and plunge, almost making him gasp with orgasmic delight, into his mind. He felt her in all her black, dark glory, her own mind a pure, focused whirlpool of forged rage. She was a chop, chop, chop of slicing blades, a crunch of bone between steel teeth, a rippling of vertebrae, a pungent perfume of acid musk that drove him almost insane with the need to abase himself in front of her, to beg to be made her slave, to serve her unto death and beyond. The Chosen lay still and imperceptibly shivered as she plunged her mind into his again and again, like a violent paramour whose hatred is as sweet as her love. I hear you, my queen, he thought as she stabbed his soul with her own. I am yours. I have done your bidding. Love me, hate me, nourish me, hurt me. On the periphery of his beautifully violated being, he sensed a gathering. His queen was drawing her forces together, marshalling her troops, gathering her storm. She was making him shine like a beacon, his agony radiating through the colony, attracting the skittering, crouching, crawling beasts under her command like moths to the flame of his exquisite pain. Come to me, the Chosen sang in his head, the song reverberating around the darkened colony. Come to me. Come to me. From the tunnels and storerooms and maintenance shafts and air ducts, and from all the secret hidden places where they had been lurking and waiting, they started to move as one. You're getting on well with the kid, Chad said as Therese toddled off toward her mother. You need to be careful, Davis. You're going to end up more dog than what, Chad? Chad shrugged. I was going to say human. I'm flattered, Davis said, but I'm not human, not yet. There's something eluding me, and I don't yet know what it is. He paused to lick his paw, then said, Cher thought it might be sacrifice that makes one human. You've sacrificed yourself 12 times, Chad said, looking out of the window. He was worried about that glass and the punishment it was taking. Always for Zula, Davis mused. Cher thought, maybe a more selfless sacrifice is what is needed. The willingness to sacrifice oneself not just for those we love, but for those we've never even met. In that case, I don't know many humans. Chad looked beyond Moran and Bromley, deep in quiet conversation, and to where Priestley was lying stock still in his makeshift bed of blankets. You don't trust him, do you? David murmured. I don't trust any of the New Albion contingent, Chad said quietly. We only have their word that they weren't involved in planning the overmorphs on LV-187. Someone took those eggs from the Clara and brought them here. It seems awfully convenient that the Victory was passing just at the right time. The infestation had occurred long before they were in LV-187 airspace, Chad. Chad looked down at Davis. Yeah, but they got the distress call on the way back to New Albion, didn't they? How long before had they passed this way on the outward leg of their trade mission? A week, maybe? Perhaps we should ask them. Maybe later, Davis said, getting to his feet and sniffing the air. I think the food's ready. Chad smiled crookedly at him. You really are becoming more dog, Davis, you know that? Moran had Bromley roused Priestley, and they all gathered around the comms hub for dishes of stew. The control desk wasn't much use for anything other than a dining table at the moment. The power was dropping in the colony, and Moran was worried. There was meant to be a goddamn baby fusion reactor somewhere in the bowels of the place. The connections to it must have been goosed, either by the storm or by the infestation. Either way, they weren't getting the power they should be. He didn't want to think about what might happen if the lights went out before whatever dawn the storm allowed to break on this place. Feeling any better? He said as Bromley helped Priestley to the table. My face is sore, Gov. I think that's the painkillers wearing off. Other than that, I'm feeling pretty chipper. He looked up at Bromley as she helped him sit. Thank you, Tisha. You're a good friend. Bromley cast a look at Moran, raising an eyebrow. He shared her vague disquiet. Where were all the off-color jokes and casual sexism they were used to? Could a near-death experience have that much of an effect on a man? Moran decided he didn't want to find out for himself. He was happy being who he was, and didn't want to change, especially not if it meant going through what Priestley had endured. Moran clapped his hands. Okay, let's eat. And for the next half hour or so, we talk about anything other than you know what. Let's give ourselves a bit of a break, people, all right? Given that the majority of the group is British now, I guess that means we have to talk about the weather, Chad said. As if on cue, there was a sudden flash of lightning right outside the window, followed by a rumble of thunder that lasted 10 seconds. Everyone gasped, and then laughed with a sudden and welcome release of the tension that had been building since they'd arrived. The stew was gloopy and thick, and not particularly hot, but Moran thought it might have been the best meal he'd ever had. The group fell into easy conversation in their 2s and 3s, and he half listened to Bromley giving him her considered opinion on West Ham's chances in the forthcoming season. The other half of his attention was on Priestley, wrapped in a blanket and pushing his food around his plate without really eating any. You okay, mate? He said as Priestley suddenly started to bang his fist against his chest. Bit of heartburn? Want some water? Priestley gave him a tight smile. Not heartburn. It's time. Time for what? Moran frowned. You want some more sleep? Time for the nativity, Priestley said. Time for me to fulfill my glorious purpose for my dark monarch, who walks in beauty like the night. Then he lurched forward, his head slamming hard on the control desk. One of the women screamed. Moran leapt up, yelling, Priestley! Jesus Christ, what the fuck? Priestley threw his head backward and arched his spine as though he was a puppet possessed by an invisible demon. "Oh no," Moran heard McLaren say. "No, no, no." "His stomach!" Bromley shouted. "The fuck?" Priestley's stomach was rippling and distending, as though something inside him was trying to punch its way out. Then he screamed and bent almost backward, his arms flailing around, knocking the plates and drinks over as he twisted in his seat. Moran was dimly aware of McLaren scrabbling for a handgun beside him as Priestley's wide, rabid eyes met his. His crewman smiled at him, a horrible, grotesque, rictus grin. "Don't feel sorry for me, Tom. I am the chosen." Then Priestley's chest exploded outward in a shower of flesh, bone, blood, and something that should not have been there. 17. Turning Point. Editorial Opinion. The Times. London, July 20, 2186. There will be much hand-wringing in the corridors of power about the news filtering in from the Wayland Isles sector of deep space and the New Albion colony, which has found itself at the center of a diplomatic row which could see ripples spreading out across the entirety of known space. It is quite possible that many ordinary people in Britain had not even heard of New Albion, just another distant colony among the stars, one of many operating under the auspices of the three-world empire, sending back resources to be used on Earth. However, New Albion was never just one of those utilitarian colonies on an inhospitable rock circling a distant sun. It always had grander ambitions than that. Over the past decade, many influential British families, who can trace their roots back to the glorious high points of our illustrious history, have been quietly investing in the colony, as have some of our most profitable and successful corporations and businesses. New Albion is not just a means to an end. It is, it appears, an opportunity to recreate everything that is best about Britain, without the shackles and chains this country has heaped upon itself for more than a century. So it should come as no surprise to anyone that Maurice Pepper, the elected Prime Minister of New Albion, has, with the support of his cabinet, declared full independence from the three-world empire. As a news organisation with Britain's best interests at heart, we should perhaps be decrying this move that potentially threatens the stability of the socio-economic bloc of which we are a part. But this country, and this newspaper, has a more venerable history and a longer memory than our relatively recent association with the three-world empire. So like many people reading this, we find it difficult to not sympathise with Maurice Pepper and the people of New Albion, and to wonder what effects this situation might have on the politics of Earth and Britain, and our sometimes uncomfortable place in a world we might no longer recognise as the one we had a major role in building. Hop off, space frogs. The Sun, July 20, 2186. The Union flag was flying over a former French colony in the Wayland Isles sector today as a plucky band of Brits claimed the oil-rich planet for breakaway settlement New Albion. One government source said that there wasn't a Frenchie to be seen on LV-187 when the brave crew of the Victory put down to answer a distress call, adding, "It was like Dunkirk all over again. Whatever trouble the French had been in, they'd all turn tail and run by the time help arrived." Sounds familiar, eh? While the Independent Core Systems Colonies conglomerate said that it would retake LV-187 by force, New Albion's Prime Minister Maurice Pepper showed true bulldog spirit by telling them in no uncertain terms to hop off. Bluster and buffoonery. New Albion can signal the greatest crisis in the history of the colonies. The Guardian, July 20, 2186. At any given time, somewhere in the world, or beyond, there is a leader who is a figure of fun. A buffoon, a blusterer who even their political enemies find somehow endearing, despite themselves. These are the most dangerous people of all. People like Maurice Pepper do not get to the office of Prime Minister of a colony such as New Albion, named last year by the Dow Jones as one of the top 100 most potentially economically and politically influential off-world colonies, without exercising a razor-sharp ruthlessness somewhere along the line. And when that is dressed up in clownish behavior, sly winks to the camera, ruffled hair and shabby suits, it is usually no accident at all. The secession of New Albion from the three-world empire might appear to be the hollow posturing of an empty vessel, but make no mistake, this Wayland Isles sector world has suddenly become the sounding board for the entire colony network, and from the United Americas to the Union of Progressive Peoples, everyone is nervously eyeing Pepper's administration to see what happens next on New Albion, and what might happen elsewhere. Would you like to see any more? Maurice Pepper's press secretary asked. Are there any more? Pepper responded, leaning back in his chair in the cabinet office of the huge concrete edifice called the Mother of Parliaments. The window behind him looking out onto what would be the River Thames when construction work was eventually completed. Lots, the secretary said. The Washington Post has a piece headlined, Assault on Pepper. Everyone in the cabinet groaned, which is actually very supportive. The colony's free news network says that New Albion is about to be, and I quote, a force to be reckoned with in the Wayland Isles and beyond. And one online site has even posted a quiz entitled, How Maurice Pepper Are You? The Prime Minister ran a hand through his unruly straw-colored hair and guffawed. I should take that. I already took the liberty of filling it in for you, the press secretary said. You are 38% Maurice Pepper, apparently. Everyone laughed again, and someone threw a screwed-up ball of paper at Pepper, which bounced off his head. He stuck up 2 fingers at the perpetrator, the Secretary for Trade and Industry. Pipe down, you lot, he bellowed indignantly. We've got serious business to discuss. At last, the Defense Secretary muttered. Pepper looked at him. Yes, quite, Roger. We'll get to you in a minute. First, I want to hear from Charlotte, if she's quite finished throwing balls at my head. The Secretary for Trade and Industry coughed and called up some graphs on the big screen on the wall of the room. Early signs are very encouraging indeed, she said. Aside from hardcore ICSC worlds which have been instructed in no uncertain terms not to deal with us, we're getting very positive responses from a lot of very big players in the Wayland Isles, who are keen to open up trade negotiations. Our stockpiles of oil and metal ores are looking like very attractive propositions, and prices on the former are rocketing as the markets took a major plunge the day after we announced our secession. Pepper beamed broadly around the room. We did that. The Secretary for Trade and Industry nodded to the Foreign Secretary. Karen and I have been working closely because we're getting a lot of early suggestions that people might be willing to enter into deeper alliances than merely for trade. Yes, the Foreign Secretary agreed. So far, we've had semi-formal communications from New Amsterdam, Constantinople, New Kemet. Pepper held up his hand. Be polite but firm. I don't want us entering into alliances. Not yet. New Albion isn't swapping one confederation of worlds for another. We are not being subsumed in a faceless mass of colonies. The entire point of this exercise, dear Karen, was for New Albion to go it alone, to lead, to stand proud. We do not want partners in this enterprise. We want acquisitions. There was a volley of cheers and fists banging on the table, and Pepper turned to the Defense Secretary. Which brings us to you, Roger. Pipe down, you lot. So, we currently have a ragtag band of highly unreliable trader types holding our first acquisition as an independent power. What are we doing to beef up our forces on LV-187? We have 2 transports ready for flight, each able to carry 30 troops. And we've cancelled all leave for the Duke of Wellington's for the foreseeable future, so we're ready to go when able. Pepper put his elbows on the table and steepled his fingers. And why, dear Roger, are our troops still sitting on their asses on New Albion, rather than about to touch down on LV-187? The Defense Secretary tapped on his tablet, and the image on the big screen changed to an image of deep space, the grey ball of LV-187 filling the monitor. We've got a drone out there sending back footage. The Defense Secretary tapped his screen again, and the image updated. This is why we haven't got any boots on the ground yet. Everyone stared at the huge cruiser hanging in space in high orbit around LV-187. That's the USC Cronulla, the Defense Secretary continued. A Bougainville-class attack transport. The United States Colonial Marine Corps are in a holding pattern above LV-187 as of 3 hours ago. Pepper narrowed his eyes. I thought the United Americas were keeping out of this. They are, the Defense Secretary acknowledged. The USCMC is essentially a private military service, working mainly for the United Americas, yes, but also in the service of Weyland-Yutani Corporation. Pepper sat back in his chair and swiveled it so he could look out of the window. Why is Weyland-Yutani interested in LV-187? It's never been one of their worlds. It's ICSC. I can see the three world empires sending a warship, but not Weyland-Yutani. Have they attempted planetfall yet? Any dropships? That's the other thing, Maurice, the Defense Secretary said. There's an incredible storm raging over the colony. No flyers are going to get in or out until it's over, and it's completely knocked out all communications. So this is why we haven't sent the Duke of Wellington's yet, Pepper said. We're not going to get past the Weyland-Yutani blockade. Not in one piece, Roger said. I mean, I've been asking you for years for funding for a proper Air Force, Maurice. For God's sake, we've closed our airspace and we don't have the ships to even enforce that. Let alone escort a troop drop to LV-187, where we might get involved in an exchange of fire. The Defense Secretary shook his head. It's not as if there isn't any money on New Albion. We could have instituted a proper military expansion program a decade ago. Instead, we throw it all at recreating Big Ben in the Thames. Roger, don't ever underestimate the power of symbolism. Pepper stood up and walked to the window, surveying the colony spread out below him. Symbols are a standard for people to rally around. They are a shield to offer protection. Symbols shine like a beacon, giving hope and confidence to the people in even the darkest times. He turned to face the entire cabinet. Symbols give hope and succor and comfort. In the shadow of a symbol, people come together to fight a common enemy. In the light of a symbol, they will surrender their freedoms for the greater good. And when it comes to it, in the embrace of a symbol, they will die for it, should that be required. There was a smattering of applause, and the Defense Secretary sighed. Symbols don't win wars, Maurice. Are you sure about that? Pepper said. King Arthur's Excalibur? Boudicca's Chariot? HMS Victory? The Spitfire? HMS Ark Royal? Symbols do win wars, Roger. They do. And you have a symbol for New Albion that is going to win this war? Roger countered. A river or a clock tower? Pepper smiled. That I do. He leaned forward to the table and pressed a button on the intercom. Send him in. The doors opened, and in marched a tall man wearing a royal blue dress uniform with a wide white belt and a black peaked cap, a red band around the white cover. He stood to attention and saluted the cabinet. Then when Pepper nodded to him, he stood at ease, legs parted, hands clasped behind his back. He had a lined, chiseled face, one scar running from his right temple to his jaw. The Royal Marines, the Defense Secretary said, looking at Pepper. What's this? You've already entered into some kind of negotiations with the Three World Empire? Or weren't we told? Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Augustus Trent, Pepper said. There is no negotiation, no surrender, no accord. Captain Trent, I know that name, the Defense Secretary said, half standing. Pepper smiled. I should expect so. He is one of the most decorated officers of the Royal Marines and a veteran of some of the bloodiest fighting in the past 30 years. He is the skipper of one of the most famous ships in the Three World Empire fleet. Pepper leaned on his fists on the table. Or rather, that was in the Three World Empire fleet. Ladies and gentlemen, God's Hammer and her crew now fight for New Albion. And the best of bloody British to them. 18. It's like a foot-tall lizard, Cher thought. Or a fat worm. Pink and bloody, like raw flesh. Its tail wrapped around it like an umbilical cord. It swiveled its head and regarded them all, standing shocked and still around the ravaged corpse of Frank Priestley. Then it opened its tiny mouth filled with pin-sharp teeth and screeched, suddenly skittering from Priestley's exploded chest cavity and across the makeshift table, scattering plates and cups as everyone leapt backward and away from it. The chest burster. She'd never expected to see it. Now she had, and she'd never forget it. A whine sounded close to her ear, and the table shook, crockery flying as a shot slammed into it just where the thing had been only a second before. "Kill it!" Chad shouted, taking aim again as the thing skidded off the table, Moran leaping away from its trajectory. "It's at its most vulnerable now. We can't let it get away." Bromley was the first to react, grabbing her pulse rifle and taking aim as the creature, baby, Cher thought crazily, skittered along the floor, heading toward one of the taped-up ducts, and then veering off to the right. Finally, Moran got his shit together and pulled out his handgun, firing off a volley of pulse bursts, always just a second behind the careening horror. Cher backed away, bumping into Marilyn and turning quickly, grabbing her and Therese and pulling them away toward the door. Chad saw her and yelled over his shoulder, "Don't open those doors! We have to contain the thing!" "We're getting it cornered," Moran said. He and Bromley letting loose pulse bursts and herding it toward the flat space beneath the window. "McLaren, take the fucking thing out!" The chest burster chattered and then dove forward. Cher realized what it was doing at the same time as Chad, as it headed directly for where one of the panels had been unscrewed from the central comms desk to cover up the vents. If it got into the innards of the comms hub, they'd never find it. "Got it in my sights," Chad said, taking aim. He squeezed the trigger just as a sudden howling gale buffeted the comms tower. All the lights went off. Cher stood stock still, barely daring to breathe. It wasn't completely black, the luminous storm clouds outside offering a faint, preternatural glow against which she could see the silhouettes of the others. She closed her eyes to blot it all out, and suddenly thought about her daddy, being told that he'd lost another daughter and not knowing why. If there was anyone to ever tell him, of course. She was going to die here on this distant planet, at the claws or teeth of a xenomorph. And they might never find her or know who she was. Even if they did, her father would never know the truth. 2 daughters killed because of a conspiracy of darkness surrounding the existence of something that everyone denied. No. No, she would not die here. She had too much to do, too important a job to finish. Cher opened her eyes. She would not look away. Too many people had done that already, and that was why Shai was dead. Why Cher would live to tell this story. Fuck. Somebody turned on a flashlight, and then another. Chad shone his underneath the comms hub. "It's in there somewhere. We're not safe." "I thought you said it wasn't dangerous," Moran said, shining his flashlight into the gap beneath the comms desk. "It will be," Chad said, "in a matter of hours. It's down there somewhere, growing as we speak." He shook his head. "We're not going to last the night in here." "Please," Marilyn said, hugging Therese to her. "You're scaring my daughter." "I'm all right, Mama." "She should be scared." Chad looked at them both. "It's the only way she's going to survive this." Marilyn had a flashlight in her bag. The Victory crew each had one, and Chad found 2 more, giving them 1 each, aside from Therese that of course gave us. He handed Cher a handgun. "You ever used one of these before?" "I'm American," she said. "So, what are we going to do?" Moran said. "If we can't stay here, where are we going to go? With no power, we can't even get the schematics of the colony." "I know the layout well enough," Marilyn said. "We were safe in the canteen before you arrived." "Far into the complex," Moran said. 2 clicks. How many of these things are out there?" "I found evidence of 27 eggs on the wreck of the Clara. they've all implanted embryos. Fuck, Bromley said. That's an army. And if there's a queen, there could be more already, Chad said. I think we can certainly say that there's a hive operating. They all looked at the dark shape of Priestley on the comms desk. Moran shone the flashlight on him for a second, then swung the beam away. Chad, Cher said. He was acting weird, like, I don't know. Can these xenomorphs, mind control people? Not that we know of. But people who spend time in a hive and survive, it changes them. I don't just mean becoming a host. I worked with a scientist. He spent time in a hive and it messed with his head. It would, Moran said. Poor Frank. God knows what he was put through in there. He shone his beam at the doors. So we're going to make a run for it. To the canteen? They all looked at each other in the dancing lights. Cher felt sick. This seemed like suicide to her. Surely they should stay here and try to kill that baby one. At least the comms room was secure, and they could call for help when the storm lifted. What about your ship? She said. There's a goddamn monster in it, Moran said. Maybe we could kill it. Hide out in there. We can't take off yet anyway, Chad said, going to the window. And if they decided to attack en masse, we'd be sitting ducks in a very confined space. How do these things hunt anyway? Moran said. Scent? Sight? Movement? We don't know for sure, Chad said. There's even a theory they can locate and zero in on human brainwaves, but it's far from proven and I'm more than a little skeptical. Sounds like you don't really know shit about these things, Bromley said, checking her rifle for the umpteenth time. There was accusation in her voice. They can die, that's all I really need to know. We should move out. Is that really? Cher said. I mean, all of us? 2 kilometers of corridors? In the pitch black. I'm inclined to agree with Cher, Chad said. You stay if you want, Moran said. He looked at Chad. Like I said, McLaren, I'm the main character in this thing. I thought you were too, but I guess there's only room for one in any story. He walked to the doors and his hand paused over the keypad. Anybody wants to come with me, fall in now. Anybody wants to stay? He shrugged. I'll make sure you get mentioned when I give my report. Moran slammed his hand onto the keypad, and the double doors whispered open. He shone his torch into the corridor and screamed as the xenomorph barreled at him, its jaws clamping down on the forearm that he threw up to protect his face. Man and monster tumbled backward into the comms room. Moran's flashlight hitting the floor and spinning around, picking out the vicious attack like an ancient stroboscopic movie show. It picked out something else as well. Cher gaped in horror as she glanced away from the xenomorph and through the doors into the corridor, shining her flashlight to reveal the darkness bubbling and boiling as though a black sea. A black sea that was a horde of xenomorphs advancing on them. Close the doors! She screamed, running forward. Marilyn blinked at her, then at Moran underneath the wiry attacker. She seemed to debate the wisdom of shutting themselves in with the creature. Now! Cher screamed. Marilyn complied and hit the pad, and the doors hissed shut. But not before a long, bulbous head forced its way through the gap, screeching and baring its rows of cruel teeth. Chad! Cher cried as the xenomorph got its hands to either side of its slick head and began to force the doors open. Chad looked at her, then at Moran, then at the alien leaning in. Fuck, he said. There was a volley of pulse fire, and the xenomorph on top of Moran writhed and twisted as Bromley's rifle punched burst after burst into it. Chad aimed a shot at the alien in the doorway and hit it on its armored head, causing it to loosen its grip on the closing doors but not forcing it back far enough. Chad, Marilyn said, in the mouth! She looked at the gun in her hand. She'd exaggerated her street smarts when Chad had asked her if she'd ever used a gun. She had, but only for shooting rats on the farm. The xenomorph began forcing the doors further open. She glanced around desperately. Moran was on his back, not moving. Chad and Bromley were emptying their pulse rifles into the twitching xenomorph beside him. It was up to her. Except she was frozen. She couldn't move a muscle. She was going to die here. I'll go get Daddy, she remembered saying to Shine, stuck up the green silo. I'll go get someone else to help. Just before Shai plunged to the ground. That chair was going to die here, and so was everyone else. Because she couldn't do anything. Merde, Marilyn said, leaving Therese cowering by the wall and running over, grabbing the gun from Chair's hands and stuffing it into the gaping jaws of the alien. She pumped the trigger several times, and the xenomorph was thrown backward. The door slammed shut. Chair sank to her haunches, back to the door, and began to sob uncontrollably. It sure is some powerful shit, Moran said, watching the acidic blood bubbling and burning through the floor underneath the corpse of the xenomorph. He'd taken a nasty bite to his forearm, and his face was slashed with claw marks, as was his chest. His jacket hung in tatters. Once he'd been assured by Chad that he wasn't going to turn into a monster, that xenomorph bites didn't work like that, he'd allowed Bromley to wash his wounds with alcohol and bandage him up. Moran looked over where Chair was still sitting, hunched against the door, hugging her knees. Hey, how many of those things did you say were out there? Chair said nothing. Moran shouted, Hey, I'm talking to you. How many xenomorphs? Leave her alone, Marilyn shouted back. She's been through a lot. Duh. Moran held up his bandaged arm. I was fucking wrestling with one of them. How many, Hunt? I don't know. She looked up at him, eyes red and puffy from crying, mascara running down her face. All of them? All of the monsters? Great, Moran muttered. Just what he needed. A hysterical woman along with a kid and a dog. These were not the sort of people for this kind of movie. He squatted down by the dead xenomorph. Ugly fucking thing. So what do we do now, Guff? Bromley paced up and down in front of the window. We can't stay here. We've got a dead alien and a dead Priestley, and this place is starting to stink. Plus that little bugger growing up under the comms desk somewhere. And we can't go outside because there's a horde of the bastards waiting to rip our heads off. So what do we do, Guff? Moran wished he knew. He stood up and scratched his beard, then became aware that everyone was looking at him. Well, he supposed he was a natural leader. I wish the power was on. Then we could see the camera footage from outside, in case those things have gone. If they've gone, it won't be far, McLaren said. Not now that they know we're in here. If only there was some other way out, Moran said. He looked at Bromley as a blast of wind rattled the big observation window. Wait a minute, he said slowly, and he reached for his gun. You're fucking crazy, Chad yelled over the howling wind that roared in through the big open space where the toughened glass of the observation window used to be. Moran had taken his gun and shot it out at the four corners. Its already weakened housings had given, and the glass had blown inward, shattering all over the comms room floor. Chad leaned over into the gale and looked down. It was 50 meters at least. A smooth metal surface with no handholds, icy rain, and winds like a battering ram. You got any better ideas, McLaren? Moran shouted. We get down there, we could get to the landing platform and into the colony buildings away from the xenomorphs. Make our way to the canteen, or even to the garage and get some of those trucks Hamilton was talking about. Just drive the fuck out of the storm. Chandler, then Marilyn. The French woman shrugged. Chair gave him a wide-eyed stare and shook her head. He sighed. Much as he hated to admit it, Moran was right. There was no other way off the comms deck. How are we going to get down? Moran pulled his head back in and looked around the room. We need to make some kind of rope, like they used to do in the cartoons, right? Tie bed sheets together. He pointed with his good arm. We could start with those blankets that Priestley was sleeping on. Everybody, go through every cupboard and see what else there is in this place. Chad thought for a moment that they should have done this before Moran shot out the window, but decided this was no time for regrets. They all started to search the room, using their flashlights, all except for Chair, who just stood there in her own pool of darkness, numbly looking at the rest of them. Chad had seen this before. A form of trauma. The human mind could barely cope with the idea of the aliens, let alone seeing them up close, let alone almost dying at their hands. In some ways, those who were killed by xenomorphs were the lucky ones. The survivors, they were the ones who had to live with the knowledge of their existence, who woke up screaming every night, drenched in sweat, who jumped at every shadow and came to view the darkness with unholy, unbridled terror. "Chair," he said as gently as he could. "I get it. I honestly do. But you're going to have to pull yourself together. I know it's hard, but you have to do it. You have to survive." "Survive," she said flatly. She looked at him. "We're all dead, Chad. We're already all dead." "Survive," he said fiercely. "You have to. We have a job to do. We have to stop this happening to anyone else." "The story," she said quietly. "I was going to write a story." She laughed humorlessly. "Who's going to believe this?" "They'll believe you, Chair," he said. "They will. That's why we need you. Do it for all those people so they never have to see what you've seen." He paused.